We are live now.
Happy Sunday, everybody. Welcome to the Atheist Republic Hangout. Today, I'm Makisha. Today we have Armin, Nirav, Sahil, Travis, and a little dude on the couch.
Benjamin.
Benjamin. And today we're going to talk about Hinduism, which means I will probably say very little because I don't know much about it, which is appropriate since, as we discussed before we went live, most people don't really know much about Hinduism. So we're going to talk a little bit about the religion, how it's affected the lives of the people who are here with us today as guests, and also probably a little bit about how it relates to atheism, why atheists don't talk about it, what atheists can discuss about it, and things like that. So let's get started with Nirav.
Well, just before we do, also the title was Hinduism and Buddhism, but we're going to cover Buddhism next week. So just wanted to clarify that.
So Nirav, what is your personal, well, give us a little bit of story about yourself, where you are from, and what your connection to Hinduism is, maybe in your past, and then currently how much you interact with it.
Well, it's interesting that there's a school of thought which already thinks that even if you're an atheist, you're technically a Hindu. And that comes down to the definition. Hinduism is about the term Hindu, which is a cognate of the term Sindhu for the Indus River. And it was a term that was applied to, in general, the religion, the culture, the philosophy of all the people of the Indian subcontinent that lived in the land of the Indus River. It's a geographical term. Now, it really doesn't tell you which God you believe in, which book you believe in. There's no single God, no single prophet. There's a great deal of diversity in the theistic schools. Like the leading one that if you really want to, if the things that you have seen, probably symbols, are about the Vedic school of theism in India. But it also includes, and this is the opinion of experts too, it also includes schools that are specifically atheistic and materialist in their view. They don't believe in God. They don't believe. They believe in the absolute natural laws that govern the universe, and so there's no governing deity. There's a very big diversity, and I was kind of raised in that diversity. I come from a family that never was an observing Hindu family. We allowed ourselves to think up our own conception of God, so we were kind of agnostic, rationalist. There was never any pressure to believe in anything in particular. I went through a phase where I was exploring, but I always kept in mind, thanks to my parents and my grandparents, that it's important to have some sort of evidence for this type of claim if you're going to believe it. And I have a lot of friends of my generation who are just agnostic and atheists. They don't have any kind of faith in a God that has a face like a elephant. But it's still, you go through these things for the sake of your parents. There's a lot of kind of cultural, it's the emphasis on it more than a case of personal conviction. And there's never any stress that you have to believe in Krishna as being your savior. So again, that left people like me with a lot of freedom to kind of come to our own, kind of understanding about what this is supposed to be about. So I'm kind of grateful for that degree of cultural tolerance in Hinduism. But there's also, if you are a theist, you're forced to swallow a lot of things that are just completely abhorrent.
Sorry about that. It took me a while to get to my microphone. Thanks, Nirav. So does Hinduism have what we would call fundamentalists, people who are theists who believe that who push that there's only one way to be Hindu, or whatever that looks like?
Yes, but interestingly, there are two types of fundamentalists. Ones are the theist fundamentalists. These are the ones that adhere to their particular type of God, and they say that the caste system that ranks humanity, and decrees to at least two castes to be completely inferior to the point that you cannot even touch them forget about having any kind of relationship or respecting them as human beings. Those are rigid doctrinal theistic fundamentalists. That's more in correlation with what you might see in Christianity or Islam. But we are seeing a strange a phenomenon that has come up in the last 30 years, gaining popularity in the last 30 years, is the one that derives itself from the meaning that I gave of Hinduism as being a geographical, cultural identity more than a religious one. Now, this is called a Hindutva, which is just being a Hindu, as in being a Hindu, as in belonging to India. And if you belong to the original religion of India, as they like to say this is, that means that, and their doctrine is very specific in decreeing Islam and Christianity as being foreign religions imposed upon India. So anyone who is a Hindu is entitled to a sense of superiority in sense of ownership of this country, and in terms of loyalty. The loyalty of Muslims and Christians always suspect. And out of this thinking emerges a fascist agenda which wants to deny. There's a degree to it. Some people are just satisfied in saying India is a Hindu country, and then there are some who come up with plans for denying voting rights to the Muslims and Christians. So this is what is ascendant right now. This is particularly relevant in the last 2 months. There's been a lot of Hindu fascism that has emerged to the top in India in the news, and that's because we have a right-wing Hindu nationalist government right now, which has a majority in parliament too. So this is becoming more and more relevant as we go.
That's fascinating. It makes it really hard to talk about Hinduism when it's so, there's such a breadth of what you mean when you say Hinduism. Does the caste system come out of, like, is it sort of a which came first situation? Like, did the caste system come politically or culturally, and then it was adopted by some sort of religious belief, or did the caste system come out of a religious belief or some sort of religious decree or a prophetic utterance, or you know what I mean? Like, how did that come about? Because I know the caste system and Hinduism tend to be closely connected in people's minds, and so I'm wondering, like, how did that come about?
Well, it does emerge from the Vedas are the oldest of the Hindu scriptures, and there are 4 books, and the caste idea of 4 castes as a way to subdivide society into professional groups. The Brahmins being the priests and the scholars, the Kshatriyas being the warriors and the kings, the Vaishyas being the traders, merchants, business people, the Shudras being the peasants and laborers. This was how they decided to subdivide society. And in the Vedas, as far as I've read and I've heard, it's not supposed to be something that you inherit by birth. However, if you have any kind of understanding of how society works, you know that this is going to be used to subdivide people, to control the rest of the population. And the ruling class, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, when this was conceived, decided that, well, if I'm a Brahmin, then my kids are also going to be Brahmin, because I don't want them to become peasants and laborers. And so it was kind of enshrined into birth, and that's when we get into this caste system of today, where it has exploded into a socio-economic kind of scope as well, because these castes have essentially become subcastes as the population grows, and they've become tribes, and they decide marriage between themselves. Their friendships are also kind of specific to their socio-economic group that they have become, and it has gone into all the other so-called religions such as Jainism and Sikhism and Buddhism even, and even in Islam and Christianity, which are specifically rejecting the caste method. It has evolved from what was originally religious to a particularly socio-economic class now. And I'd also like to know what Sahil thinks about this point.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Sahil, first of all, what is your experience with Hinduism personally?
Well, a lot of it, mostly it's been like Neeraj's been talking about. I was born in a Hindu family, but my father, I think, has always been an atheist, and my mother was always a liberal Hindu. So I wasn't really pushed into the religion as such. And as far back as I can remember, I thought that it was a lot of nonsense, because mostly I took part in a lot of the rituals and the traditional cultural practices that that one has to, but I never really thought that it made sense. And so modern India, I mean, I'd like to stress that the problems with Hinduism and religion in general are they're in a way very similar. So even though, as Nirav described, Hinduism is a very complex religion. It's not just a religion. It's also a philosophy, a cultural concept. Even though all of that is true, the problems that Hinduism brings into our country is more or less the same problem that Christianity does or Islam does. And so one must, I mean, remember that it's not the religion but the religious impulse that creates the problem. And you may stress however much you want that Hinduism is very complex, and it encompasses atheism and agnosticism and all the rest of it. But those with the religious impulse will eventually find ways of creating some sort of simplistic, dogmatic sort of ideology that we all know. I mean, that we all sort of characterize in our heads as religion.
So, do you have any people in your family with that religious impulse, as you articulated, that
No, I think
makes it difficult, or?
I think that occurs, I think, about as normally in all populations, so as it does in the West. So I think there are some people. I mean, I have a few uncles and aunts who are, I mean, dogmatic in a sense, but my immediate family has always been more liberal. And so the emphasis I'd like to make here is that while we discuss Hinduism as an Eastern religion, we must also keep in mind that it's in its worst case, it's as simplistic as Islam or Christianity.
What's funny about that is actually they're imitating Islam and Christianity, because if you actually read the Hindutva agenda, the Islamic concept of a dhimmi as a non-Muslim who is a second, relegated to actually what is worse than second-class status, exploitable slave is the best way to put it. This is what they exactly what they have in mind for a Muslim or a Christian or basically someone who doesn't agree with them. And this is something that has been created in the 1920s. So it doesn't come from the bulk of the heritage and history of Hinduism. It doesn't come from there. It's been coming from very much from the
sure
point
you're right,
that Islamist politics came to rise in India.
But I think I don't think it would be wise to assume that, I mean, that this kind of dogmatism did not exist before the Islamic invasion of India. I mean, I'm sure that any religion, whether it starts off as a complex philosophy or as a simple dogma, it eventually morphs, and in not a long time it morphs. I mean, the believers are always going to be the ones who want a very simple doctrine of hatred and divisionism. So I mean, I don't believe that Hinduism could not have become corrupt if we had not been invaded by Islam. I mean, I think a religion inherently carries with it that sort of ideology of
Yeah.
So another academic question, just so that I have a somewhat of an understanding. Where did the Vedas come from? Were they written by a prophet? Is there was there words from God? Most holy books are like words from God through a prophet written down. Is it like that, or were they compiled from lots of people, or how did that come about?
Well, they've been written by scholars, and I mean, so far as I know, they sort of they've descended from the cultural concept of writing down. I mean, the civilizational concept of writing down philosophy in India. So they've just been handed down as philosophical concepts, and they morphed into a religion very organically, unlike what, I mean, Christianity or Islam claims. So there is no one holy book. There is no single unified philosophy. So it more or less it's been a cultural concept, and it's evolved rather than handed down by God. And most of the original writers of the Vedas were in fact quite intellectual, and their works are even today if studied in their true form, very complex and interesting.
Here I have a slightly divergent point to add, because I'd like the history and the myth basically of this tells us that the Indian people, I mean, the Vedas came with the Indo-Aryan civilization. Now it's a hotly contested theory of where exactly the Aryan came from. The consensus view is that they were migrants from Central Asia, and at the same time, the Hindu nationalists want to portray Aryans as indigenous people. The Vedas, the only thing I would like to add to Sahil's point is that Vedas were basically orally transmitted for several generations before being put down in writing, and they were being put down, codified by the class that are called Brahmins, the priests, and a lot of the epics such as the Ramayana and the Bhagavad were composed by such Brahmins. And then again, there's the historical research in India is sadly pathetic. Because there are enough gaps to allow people to come up with ridiculous ideas. One of the Indian political leaders, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, had published books saying the Vedas were composed by bards in the Arctic. The ice regions of the Arctic are where the Aryan civilization came from. And this idea was a triumphalist view that was popular despite the ridiculousness of it. You can immediately realize how ridiculous it is. But it was quite popular, and people still hold that kind of.
Oh, I lost the volume there. Nora, if we lost your volume, I'm not sure what happened, but we couldn't hear you for the last few seconds there. I'm gonna open it up to anybody else who might want to share some thoughts or experiences they have with Hinduism at all.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Is there any effort among Hindu fundamentalists or Hindu or religious Hindu people to convert? I mean, I think I already know that there is very little of this, but is there any effort of like Christianity and Islam for converting people to Hinduism? Does it even make any sense for people to be converted to Hinduism, or is it just something that people are born with, and if you're not born into a Hindu culture, then you're technically never a Hindu? We can't hear.
We can't hear Nirav, so we're gonna.
Until then, Sahil, can you?
Yeah.
Sahil, can you speak to that question?
I mean, it's funny you should mention that, because in the last few days, actually, there's been a lot of talk in the in the Indian media about this very issue. So what happened a few hundred years ago and continues to happen to this day is a lot of people in India belonging to the Hindu lower castes used to convert to Islam or Christianity, because that would, in a sense, entitle them to a minority status and get rid of the burden of a lower caste for them. But with the rise of Hindu nationalism, what has happened is that in the last few weeks, actually, there have been quite a few programs by right-wing nationalist parties to reconvert these ex-Hindus back to Hinduism. So as far as I know, it's not forbidden. Anybody can become a Hindu, and what these political parties which have now come to power want to do is to create a sort of a unified Hindu national identity in India, which and they're trying to sort of whip up a lot of steam by sort of converting ex-Hindus back to Hinduism. So they call it Ghar Wapasi, which means returning home, and they've held quite a few of these programs in Indian cities. So it has increasingly been debated. I mean, this topic is currently quite the thing in India.
So what would an ex-Hindu be? Somebody who's another religion?
Yes,
I mean,
like I said, a lot of Hindus converted to Islam or Christianity because they had been burdened with the lower caste. So they were people of lower castes who wouldn't have opportunities or even the respect of society. So they increasingly found it easier to just convert to a minority religion in India, as Christianity is or Islam is. And and you also benefit because as a Muslim or a Christian, you get a minority status, which in some cases entitles you to better, I mean, to jobs or what in India we refer to as reservation. So there is reservation for minorities, and you can benefit from that. So a lot of people did convert from Hinduism to other religions.
So as a member of a low caste in Hinduism, a lot of jobs are not available to you. Is that correct?
Not just that. I mean, there is even reservation for lower caste Indians, Hindus. But the fact is that the lower castes are increasing. I mean, they are basically living in poverty, and when you sort of think about it, they don't get the very basic sort of facilities that would enable them to compete. I mean, they don't get the kind of education that middle class or upper class Indians can. So because they have been in poverty and for generations they've lived in poverty, so they don't really have many options to sort of improve their lot.
So, Narav, go ahead and whatever you were saying before, you can just jump in and start saying. We missed that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Yes, on point of conversion, they have just begun to emphasize, the Hindu nationalists again, have been emphasizing a campaign of reconversion of the Muslims and Christians, which they hold had left Hinduism due to coercion and due to force during the time of Muslim conquest of India. Now, it's as far as generally conversions go, if you really want to become a Hindu, you can. But there's never been any.
What would that involve? Like, what would, if I said I'm going to become a Hindu, what would that, since it doesn't seem like there's a lot of codified dogma or you know, a single god, or what would that involve?
It would involve, I mean, if you specifically went to a temple, they would perform a Shuddhi ceremony, which is a brief ritual, and it means purification. So you're purified from your past or whatever, you know, to become a Hindu.
Okay.
But as such, I mean, if there are a lot of people who have, you know, have such a great attraction to Hinduism, they just start calling themselves Hindu, and nobody actually demands that you go through it. Nobody demands that you, for example, as if in Islam you would have to adopt a name. You don't have to change your name. You don't have to change anything about you except probably stop eating beef. Is the only thing they would really try to emphasize.
But no, I think on the point of vegetarianism, I mean, vegetarianism is a feature of only very specific kinds of Hinduism. I mean, there are many Hindu cultures that are completely non-vegetarian, and Hinduism as such doesn't have any you know, non-veg. I mean, originally did not have any vegetarian philosophy. I mean, that I think has come about.
Not just blanket non-vegetarianism. This is about beef.
Okay, yeah, that.
Yeah, I was going to say there aren't people who call themselves Hindus who eat beef, are there? I wouldn't think.
No. That is ubiquitous, looked down upon in India.
They won't admit to that very freely, but there are a lot of people, especially folks who migrate to out of India. They will at one point or the other they feel that they'll eat beef. And
there's lots of those here in Vancouver. I know lots of Indian, you know, people who came from India who would still call themselves Hindu. They would be what you had talked about before, Narav, like atheist. They're still basically atheists. They would call themselves Hindu still, but they definitely eat beef. So it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of Judaism in the sense that being Jewish is also very cultural and ethnic, and you can be an atheist and still be a Jew. And so in a lot of ways it definitely has some of those, I don't want to say they're alike, but it makes me think of that, because culturally there's a lot of the same conflicting sort of conversations, make it really difficult to talk about. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be a Hindu? Well, if you're talking culturally or ethnically, or are you talking religiously? Obviously, Judaism has a much more easily identified religion that you can say, well, this is Judaism. But so when you say Hindu nationalism, you basically mean Indian nationalism. See, there's that's another that's a linguistic complication to me. You're talking about anybody can be a Hindu, but not anybody can be Indian. So there is a division there in some way.
Well, the genuine Indian nationalism that emerged at the time of the Indian independence movement emphasizes that there's no religious qualification. It's equal for all Indians, Hindu, Muslim, Christian. Hindu nationalism emphasizes that you even replace the name India and you replace the name Indian with and call yourself Hindu. So all Muslims have to call themselves Hindu, even though the consensus is that it's a religious identity. So that's where your question actually gets to the very nub of what they are attempting to do. The Hindu nationalists want and would love it to be seen as Indian nationalism, but in fact most Indians, liberal Hindus, secular-minded people, say Indian nationalism is about the love of India, and we don't give a damn. It's about Muslims can be Indian nationalists, but they can't really be Hindu nationalists. This is the debate that's going on right now in India. There's no settled answer for that, though.
It sounds very muddy and very complicated.
They thrive on it, believe me. They thrive on this confusion because that's how they will make Hindus feel. That look, these Muslims are not willing to give respect to the Hindu religion, so they don't really care about India. These are two separate things. But if you talk like this, you'll begin to corner a lot more Hindus into your camp, and they'll begin to look at Muslims as being always those guys who wanted to split India up into India and Pakistan. So these are the nerves that they pit.
I think that is more understandable. I mean, that phase of Hinduism is more understandable to people. I mean, who only know about Christianity or Islam, because that is the essence of the religious impulse. Because when you combine religion with politics, which is what most right-wing movements do, that's what you get, and that's not very different from the right-wing parties of any country.
Yeah, well, that's where I can definitely see this becoming an issue for secularists to take on, because I think, and we talked about this a little bit before we went live, that, and it made me think, why should atheists, for example, I don't want to say atheists as a whole, because we don't want to tell people what they should care about, but why should any of us really care much about Hinduism? Because at first it sounds like a philosophy. It sounds like this sort of vague thing out there in the ether that nobody can get their hands on. It's like trying to pin Jello to the wall. But what you guys are talking about really gets, I think, to the heart of why we should care, is in the sense when you are combining politics and national identity with religion, that becomes extremely dangerous. And is that what you guys are seeing? Seal, is that what you're sensing or seeing, or is that kind of along the lines?
I think it will become more and more apparent. I think it will become more and more apparent in the coming years, because as India becomes more important to the world, and as the the parties in power become more brazen with their Hindu agenda, you will. I mean, even the West will begin to hear about this more and more. I'm pretty sure that will happen. At the moment, there is a majority support to these parties, not because they profess a particular religion, but because they seem to be an alternative to the corruption that was bogging India down. But eventually, once these people once these people show themselves to be what they are, which is as corrupt as the people they want to replace, we see a lot more of this religious agenda coming forth. And as India becomes more important to the world, I think we will hear more about this. And there is already a lot of concern in India regarding the radicalization of Hinduism and the nationalist movement. So India is already debating it, which is I think a good sign, because a society that is absolutely without fear of something as dangerous as this, that's problematic. But we realize that there is a problem, and some of us are already raising our voices.
I agree with Sahil entirely on this, except to add one thing, that from the world's, from a realpolitik point of view, there's only one thing that would really bother the world about something that would happen.
Oh, we lost you again. We lost your volume again. I'd
We
really love
lost-
to hear what Nirav has to say, though.
Yeah, that was the beginning of something very important. But can I ask a question? It just well, actually, I should have asked this when Nirav is here too, so you could answer. But I can repeat this if you want. But my question is that why, if I want to be the devil's advocate and try to see if there's any way we could argue that atheists shouldn't get involved with Hinduism. For two reasons. One, maybe, and I'm not saying I believe in this. I'm just trying to bring this point across. One is, it seems like all the problems associated with most of the major problems associated with Hinduism are political issues rather than religious issues. And because it's more of a political problems that is causing rather than religious, maybe this is not in the domain of atheist activists. And another thing, how like atheist activism is more about criticizing problems within ideologies, and to be able to criticize an ideology, you need to have a set of ideology to criticize. How could you even criticize a so-called religion that doesn't have a set of belief system? Every time you point at something, people will be like, well, this is not part of all Hinduism, and there's probably nothing that you could point at as a whole to represent Hinduism. So in a sense, there's no way to technically, go over it and analyze it critically, because there is no set of core beliefs.
Well,
I'll just say just a little bit that the second part of what you said is true. That it's very difficult to criticize Hinduism as an ideology because it's so complicated. But the first bit about it being political is not true. Actually, the dominant political parties profess to be secular. I mean, although they are very openly not. But what they have brought with their victory in India in the last election is these religious and also political organizations that are increasingly becoming more and more brazen and posing a threat to the secular identity of India. So it is a religious issue, but the only way you can criticize it is to be political about it. I mean, so that's all I have to say.
What I'd like to add to is the second part of what Armin said, is that a lot of these things, if you ever meet Hindus who say that the caste system is not really part of Hinduism, they're effectively using the same tactics that apologists for Islam or Christianity use. The fact is that there is a long tradition of atheist critique of Hinduism, dating back at least to the 19th century, if not more. And this is specifically targeting the caste problem, which, by and large, is the biggest problem with Hinduism. The caste problem affects between 200 to 300 million people who are officially, even to this day, considered to be untouchables. And although the bigotry is kind of, it's gone behind closed doors right now.
We lost your volume again, Nirav. Sorry, I think you might have a short in your microphone or something.
But I can still hear him.
Pardon, Sale?
I can still hear him. I mean,
You can? Can anybody else hear him?
Yeah. No, he's not speaking right now, but I think I could hear him till the end.
No, I can't hear him.
That's funny. Nirav brought up a point that when I asked the question about the holy books and things like that, and we were talking, and the caste system was mentioned, I was thinking that the caste system addressing that problem does definitely seem to be an important, or really the issue that can be addressed by the West if people so choose to take that on. And I was wondering if that is actually a religious thing or a political thing, which is where my question originally came from. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, that it does come out of Hinduism as a religion or a philosophy. Is that correct? Is that a correct understanding? In other words, were one to take
more
on the caste system, you would have to take on Hinduism.
You have to. I mean, the basis of the caste system is religious. It's true, but caste is a major political issue in India because there are many big political parties that identify themselves solely on the basis of representing a particular caste of Hindus. So you really cannot separate the religious from the political in India because it is so complexly intertwined with each other. I mean, so the point about it being a religious issue, yeah, it's true, it is a religious issue, but I mean, there are political parties that profess to represent caste, and the caste politics is more or less the dominant politics in many northern states of India. So you really can't separate the political from the religious, and a critique of by the West of India would have to involve a political critique. It would have to be something that denounces many of the right-wing parties, and I don't see that happening because to be fair, India is democratic, and the parties we have elected, even though they're right-wing fascist parties, have been democratically elected. So I don't see the Western countries coming forward to denounce the BJP that won the last election.
So what are atheists doing in India? What's happening with atheism in India right now?
Oh, atheism has been, I mean, since independence, there has been a significant population of atheists in India, and until about the 1960s or 70s, atheism wasn't considered to be, something that you'd have to fight for, because India has always been secular. At least after independence, it was quite obvious that India wanted to establish itself as a completely secular country. And only recently has it become difficult for one to speak out against religion. I mean, to say critique Islam or Christianity or Hinduism for that matter. So recently it's become an issue. Atheists have become more proactive in a sense because they realize that their freedoms of expression are being curtailed increasingly, and but it wasn't that big an issue before. So.
Raf, do you have anything to add? I don't know if you're frozen or not. Does anybody else have any experiences with Hinduism or questions, or anybody who hasn't really? Michael or Travis, do you have any thoughts or questions? Or
for myself personally, I just don't have a lot of experience with Hinduism, so I'm actually getting a lot of information from you two folks that honestly I've just never had a chance to learn in the general public. I don't do a lot of research in religions per se, so it's good to hear, for instance, how they've been tied politically. Something I wouldn't have guessed just from watching.
I'd like to just, if my voice isn't very
I thought I'd give it a second to resolve, but I'm not getting anything from Narav again.
Yeah.
Travis, how about you? What are your experiences with Hinduism, if any?
Well, at a young age, I went. Are you having problems hearing me?
No, you're good.
Okay. At a fairly young age, I went around reading just about every religious text I could get a hold of, and the Bhagavad Gita was one of them. And that has been a while. But I think one of the most amusing, at least anecdotes, that I can come up with is that hold on, bud. Is that when I was at my very first year of college, I think they were Buddhist monks or something walking around the campus, and they were selling copies of the Bhagavad Gita because there are some similarities between the two. But what amused me the most about it was the fact that when you were like, yeah, sure, I'll buy your book, somewhere out of this robe would come this credit card machine. This massive credit card machine, and I was just, I couldn't believe they were carrying it around, and I didn't realize that, and I've seen that kind of thing from people who claim to be Hindu. I live in a place that has very, very little diversity. But I guess first I'll say that with whatever's going on in India right now, as far as always kind of being a secular country, I think that if atheism has always kind of had rights, and they're just starting to kind of lose them now, and they're aware of that, and they're speaking out against it, as long as I guess they can maintain that, I suppose that secular humanism would be more the realm of argument that you would have to pursue for things in India politically. I think that's just what comes to mind. Because, like a lot of people say, atheism, of course, is just a lack of belief in any god, right? So I think that in this particular situation where you've got both of them intertwined, the religious and the political, that you're probably looking at going a little bit further than just not believing, just being an atheist, in order to push that discussion. But I have another question. I just have one question. A lot of people seem to be confused, specifically about the Hindu religion, as to whether or not it's monotheistic or polytheistic. And I wanted to ask either of our two experts here what exactly Hinduism can be classified as, just for those that don't know.
Both.
Well, I'd like to say first off that I'm not an expert.
You're the expert in the room.
Hinduism it has always, I mean, it is polytheistic in a sense, but there were many Reformation movements that took place most recently around the time of independence. So a lot of monotheistic ideologies have been fused into the Hindu religion. But it has been, culturally speaking, polytheistic, because you can be a Hindu and worship many different gods and have your own favorite gods and dislike some other gods, and all of which is possible as a Hindu. So it is essentially, its doctrines are more or less polytheistic. But a lot of, a lot of monotheistic ideologies have been fused into Hinduism, in its Reformation that occurred quite a few times in India's history.
One school of particular interest is the Advaita, which is essentially argues that God is in everything. You can worship a tree and you're worshiping the one God, and you're worshiping the sky and you're worshiping the one God. God can be both formless and with form. And so that's the kind of a uniting thread that that they rationalize their faith on this score. There's no hardcore allegiance to idol worship, and then again, there's no insistence that God can only be formless. So that's how faith is kind of unified in all this diversity.
Yeah, again, that makes it. I mean, just the fact that neither one of you could really quickly answer that question with a single answer, it just makes it even more complicated to really discuss and to understand. And it's almost like really without being Indian, it's very difficult to understand because it's so entwined.
Right to the nub, because I think it's very much quintessentially Indian. But perhaps this very difficulty should make us ask: should we deal with Hinduism as one religion? Why don't we just, if you really want to break it up, criticize the Vedic religion or some specific parts of Hinduism? That would be easier and perhaps more productive. Instead of trying to take it all on at once.
That's a really good point.
The problem is that the proponents of the radical Hindu movement are not well versed with the. I mean, it's more difficult to argue with them along scriptural or lines. So a Muslim, for example, knows the basic teachings of the Quran, but you can find a sword wielding Hindu in India who has practically no knowledge of the original scriptures. So in a sense, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
If you're trying to score an ideological point, you can't do it. I mean, you have to deal with them politically.
Yeah, but you only have to argue with those who are, you know, look, if you're, it would be a point-to-point discussion. If someone is really
Right.
trying to apologize for the caste system, then you'd stick it to them on the caste system. I think you would have to take a kind of a piecemeal approach rather than say, well, the whole thing is absolutely rotten, which you know, you can't do that without making multiple errors, you know.
Yeah.
So can I just want to ask a question regarding what you guys are saying. So for an atheist activist that is interested in getting involved in looking at Hinduism and maybe even helping other atheist activists within India, so wouldn't the caste system be the best thing to get started with? Because that's one of the, for two reasons. One, because that's one of the main problems. That is one of the with Hinduism, and one of the few belief systems that is more common among Hinduism. Rather than, there are a lot of things that everybody points out to that is not shared among a lot of Hindu viewpoints, but it seems like the caste system is something that you could point to as something that is uniquely Hindu. And it's also, as you pointed out, is something that is affecting many, many, many people. And also some people actually that I talk to are suggesting that the caste system is not as big of an issue anymore. So is that actually the case? So that's two questions. One is the caste system the main thing that that atheist activists should focus on when it comes to Hinduism, and also is the caste system still a big problem?
Well, personally, caste is very much a big problem because even though people want to pretend right now that it doesn't exist, it does exist behind closed doors, and what's today behind closed doors can come out in the open tomorrow. It won't take very long. However, I don't think caste is a good starting point, because caste is something that has been around for 4,000 or 5,000 years, and the evidence is that you cannot really change this thing except as a multi-generational effort. It's going to take at least 100 200 years.
We lost you again.
Sahil can sum up the last little bits if you heard. Sahil, did you hear the last bits of what Ram said?
I agree with what he said. And yes, it is difficult to uproot this problem. And yes, it might take a few more generations, but I think sort of a political and even economic freedoms, once they're given to these people, it'll help to speed the process up tremendously. I think what people fail to realize when we talk about religion in India, we have to understand that there is a huge number of people who are very, very poor. India is by no means a even moderately rich country. So the problems of religion more or less deal with the poorest of the poor, people who have not had education for generations. So and that is why it is proving difficult to uproot. And a lot of the political power and support is drawn from these people who see no other option for them except to join caste-based political parties that proclaim that they'll win them their rights and so on. So the economic problem in India is one of the main reasons why it is so pernicious, this problem. Yeah, I mean, I do think that it is something you can argue with somebody who defends the caste system, but in the general media and in people in power, people who do the politics, they will never tell you on your face that they support the caste system. So the caste system is looked down upon, but it still exists, and people sort of play their politics on it, as it were.
I have never seen any statistics about this, but do you know if Hinduism is, in terms of commitment to it as a religion, is it often seen more in lower socioeconomic situations? Like, is it related to the commitment to the religion? Is it related to level of education, financial stability, things like that.
Definitely, definitely. I think you will find you will find, yeah, I mean, even a small survey on the website can tell you that. So most of the atheists and openly agnostic and atheists and secularists in India, you'll find, are at least in the middle class. I mean, they are people who have at least obtained a decent school education and have more or less gone to college. So the predominant secular movement, the secular movement predominantly sort of resides within the middle class. So if you go down to the lower classes, the adherence to religion, to the customs, to the caste system itself is more strict, definitely, and because it tends to it is the most it is the biggest factor that gives them identity. So identity is grounded in religion, especially among the lower castes. And once you go into the upper caste, I mean, once you are say a well-educated Indian in the middle class, you can almost mean very easily sort of get rid of your religion. There's no problem as such for people who are educated, but it is the poor people who suffer most from.
Which brings up a point that I've heard, and it was mentioned by Travis earlier, sort of briefly, but the idea that a secular humanist approach, which tends to speak more to, I'm gonna rewind. I'm gonna start over there. A lot of atheists, particularly within secular humanism, believe that when you address the economic and education needs of people, that you don't. It makes it much easier to address the religious issues, and in fact, often you don't even need to combat religion as such within that particular culture, because the people themselves, once they rise to a certain status or a certain comfort level financially with their education, jobs, and things like that, they themselves leave their religion behind, which is an interesting point of, it's a debate amongst many in the atheist community, and I think it would be an interesting point for us to discuss at some point, if it's more strategic, at least in certain situations, to deal with those issues as opposed to trying to get people to not believe in their religion. Is that something?
That is especially true for India, because
Yeah.
in India, once you most of the schools too in India are secular. They don't overtly publicize any particular religion, and it is easier as an educated Indian to break free, because most of the higher education institutes and institutions in India are mostly secular. I mean, they have been founded as secular institutions. So the most educated people in India invariably are some form, at least they are deistic. I mean, at the most, and a lot of them are atheists. So it is much easier in India just to educate people and let them break free themselves.
On that note, I want to give everybody a last, as we're coming upon the hour, I want to give everybody a chance to chime in, ask questions. We'll just kind of open it to general topics as well, if there's anything we need to discuss or any questions people have. I'll open that up just for a few minutes here. Anybody?
I have a question if nobody else has.
Go for it.
So, if anybody else has a question, I could ask mine later, but apparently they don't. Okay, so it seems, based on what I read, it seems like Hinduism has traditionally used to be a very open religion when it comes to sex and sexuality. But that's in India, however, among Hindus these days, they seems to be a lot more conservative about any expression of sex or sexuality. How is it religion that, it's true, if you look at their texts, if you look at their teaching, was so open and so liberal about this topic, all of a sudden in recent times became more conservative, even though that kind of viewpoint is not actually represented in their ancient texts.
That's a very good point, actually, and It is what you said is absolutely true. Hinduism, the Hindu doctrines, I mean the Vedas and so on, have always been very liberal about sexuality. I think, and a lot. This is the general consensus in among Indian academics too, that the the occupation of India by the British. I mean, in the 200 years that India was a British colony, uh, Hinduism imbibed a lot of what is called the Victorian prudence, or I mean, the 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 treatment of sex as a taboo, I think, has its roots in that, and perhaps before that with the Islamic invasion. But again, I say that, I mean, if you have a religion as complex as Hinduism, it still doesn't take very long for it to morph into a very simplistic, very dogmatic sort of ideology, because that is the religious impulse. I mean, you leave people with no religion and they will still find something like this to sort of impose on everyone else. And it doesn't matter that Hinduism is so complex and so open to all forms of discussion. It still doesn't matter. The people who enforce this are, as I said, not very well versed with the even the most basic tenets of what that are written in the scripts. So, like I said, I mean, that's the problem. Hinduism has been broken. I mean, sort of squeezed into this very simplistic ideology that this doesn't do it justice.
I think this is that's very much a human impulse. I heard a great podcast one time that was talking about cognitive dissonance and how hard it is for humans to dwell in these spaces of that aren't clear. You know, I think something like Hinduism is almost it's almost inevitable that it's going to be compressed or distilled or taken down into some easy way of being, because I mean we're having a hard time talking about it. How can people, you know, how can people live it if it's almost impossible to even talk about without making it more simplistic, without making it more of a religion with dogmas and things that people are supposed to follow, you know? So I think that's almost a human impulse to be that way.
Yeah, and I think if you think about conservatism in general, you'd see that these things are almost ubiquitous in all forms of conservative movements. Sex, liberty of, I mean, freedom of speech, and especially blasphemy and such things. So these issues will always be the cornerstones of any conservative movement. It doesn't matter what their basis is. I mean, so.
And on that note, we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank Sahil and Nirav in particular for sharing with us their wealth of knowledge and experience. Even though they are not professionals, as they've reminded us, they are the professionals in the room, the experts in the room.
That's what professionals usually say.
Yeah. So thank you guys so much for this. Was really good and really interesting, and I appreciate your willingness to kind of step out of the comfort zone and really share a lot with us about India and about Hinduism. And I want to invite everybody back next week, same time, same place. I would make a cultural reference. Same bat time, same bat place, but I'm sure lots of people wouldn't get that. Oh, Michael smiled. So please join us again next week, and I believe we'll be talking about Buddhism, but we will put that up and promote that to you guys when we finalize that. Thank you guys. Have a great week.
All right. Bye-bye.